Okay, we are recording, so from now on, anything that you say will be recorded for those at home who want to watch. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel just like we did last time. We will allow public comments from anyone who wants to react. We didn't get any last month, but as we continue in our COVID operations, we may get more and more viewers who want to comment that way. Those will be posted online if we get any by the end of the month. After that, they'll just be forwarded along. So I will go back to sharing my screen that has the slides. And can everyone see that? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, then, without much further ado, we will get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this virtual August STRAC meeting. I know that it's not quite the same as meeting in person, but it's really nice to see all of your faces and hear all of your voices. So we've got a pretty great agenda today. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. We have a special guest with us from Community Planning and Development, Mr. Abe Barge. He will be presenting a little bit later on about accessory dwelling units, ADUs, and short-term rentals. So that should be a really fun discussion. So to kick it off, we will start with our licensing and enforcement update. So this is our typical data that we show. This is our licensing trends. As you can see, we've seen a little bit different of trends in 2020. We are down about 16%, which is about 400-ish licenses from where we were a year ago, August of 2019. I think that's not a surprise to anybody considering the pandemic. And we also have seen a decrease in the number of unique short-term rental properties that are listed that we're finding through our software. So that's about down 23%, which is about 806 properties from last August. And around the start of the year, we had started seeing decreased property postings. That trend started to be accelerated. And then obviously much more steeply since March 2020 as a result of the pandemic and then some of those restrictions. But the good news is that we are still seeing a very high compliance rate. So of the active licenses and the listings that we're seeing, 82% of those are licensed, which is great. That's about 10% increase from where we were a year ago. So even though we've seen a decrease in some of our active listings and our active licenses, that compliance rate has gone up. Our highest compliance rate ever stands at our 86.8%, which was from June of this year. So that is just something to note. This is a new slide. It kind of just shows week by week the specific numbers since beginning of the year so that you can kind of see some of those trends a little bit more in detail. So the red line there is that number of unique properties that we're seeing listed. The yellow line is the number of active short-term rental licenses, which has gone down just a bit. And then the green line is that licensing rate, that compliance rate. 81.8, which shows up as 82 on the previous slide. So it looks like Dana has a question. Go ahead, Dana.
Hi, everyone. I just had a question for clarification around, I know that Excise has been super busy with a lot of things on their plate. So the ability to put the focus or emphasis on short-term rentals has been, definitely bogged down with other burning priorities. And I know that there are hosts that are waiting to have, their license approved for renewal after signing an affidavit or after questioning. I'm curious if the data, if host compliance marks a license like how long? So say the license ends August 1st, that's when it expires. If that license holder, if that host is still listing while they're waiting for a response back from excise and license, I'm curious if host compliance deems that listing as having an or an expired short-term rental license on it. I'm just curious about some of those windows there.
Brian, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I would have to talk to, I didn't press mute, did I? You can hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, I would have to check with Kim on that. She sends our stats over. But you're basically talking about a 3-month window there, and anything that's delayed in renewal is being investigated. And I want to say there's probably 40 to 60 in that category. I want to say. So it's not a game changer in terms of that.
And then my other question around that data is, I know, Brian, you and I have had a conversation where a property can have multiple listings if they have different configurations of the property using the same license number, but the property can't be booked with different reservations. And so when we're counting the number of short-term rental licenses that are granted, and then we count the number of active listings, does host compliance have the ability to say, sure, there's more active listings, but some of these license numbers are being used multiple times, but they're still falling within our compliance for our city?
Yeah, that's why it's number of unique properties. So if you are doing it correctly, so if you had, a house at whatever 100 Broadway, where you had one bedroom that you sometimes rented and then sometimes the whole house, if you had your license number on both of those ads, then host compliance considers that one unique property.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Buffy?
I think that was Dana.
Oh, sorry, Buffy asked the same question.
I did
Oh.
ask a question, and yes, it does answer that question for
But
me.
can I add, this is Matt Middlebrook at Airbnb. I am, just to follow up on this, because the active STR licenses is 2205, which is the 82% of 2694. So the license rate is lining up with one license per unique. So is it licensing, but so this term changes it from compliance rate to licensing rate. So are licensing rate and compliance rate the same thing? Because I am curious, because I think what the question is like, are second rooms falling into that compliance rate?
They should be if the person puts their license number on the advertisement. So
can we go back to the previous chart? Can we go back to the previous chart?
Yeah.
Sure. So we have used the term licensing rate and compliance rate somewhat interchangeably. And it's that, blue line at the top of this chart here. And it's essentially showing the percentage of unique listings, of unique addresses, unique properties that have a license.
I got it.
So it's not a, we do use the term compliance rate. It's not a, foolproof term because there are other ways that a property could be out of compliance. But it gives us a general idea of the main thing to be in compliance, which is to have a license.
I got it. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Hey, Erica, this is Molly. Can we go back to Dana's first question real quick?
Sure.
So I just wanted to comment on that because I think, Brian answered the question. I don't know if your question was specific to renewals, but I guess I do just want to clarify that if it was a new short-term rental that has never been licensed or had a license that had fully gone out of date and expired, then they should not be operating until they are licensed. And so even if there's a window or a lag time in excise and licenses for processing, you can't operate until you have that license. Renewals, if it's a delay on our end and they got in the renewal application before their expiration date and everything like that, that's a little bit different. But a brand new short-term rental that's should not be operating prior to getting a license.
Yes, that was my understanding. Thanks for confirming.
And one other, this is David Pardo. To confirm, let's say you have your valid license and it's 3 weeks before your license expires. You submit your renewal form, and the day after your license expires, you still haven't gotten word from the city one way or another about whether you're going to be renewed or not, or if there's any further action that needs to be taken. You are okay to continue operating? Yes?
If you have a complete application on file and have paid the fees, you can continue to operate.
Cool.
Great. It looks like Lisa has a question about unique properties. Go ahead, Lisa.
If you could just clarify the definition of unique properties, please.
So what Dana was referring to is some people, so say a single person lives in a 3 or 4 bedroom house, and for 2 weeks out of the month they're at home and they want to rent 1 bedroom while they're home, but then they travel for 2 weeks, and while they're gone for 2 weeks they want to rent the whole house. They would have 2 separate ads on Airbnb, one for the 1 bedroom and then one for the whole house. So instead of counting that as 2 ads, it's counted as 1 unique property. So you could literally have 4 or 5 ads for 1 house. If it becomes a mind-boggling mess to try and manage those calendars to not have more than 1 person there. But there is no rule against the number of ads you can have for a house. And for example, if you run an ad on Airbnb and then VRBO and Flipkey, that's not 3 different ads, that's 1 unique property. So we may have something like 13,000 ads that are live in Denver, but only 2,600 of them are properties that are for rent.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. So just a few things to note about these numbers. Since the beginning of the year, we have seen a decrease of about 14% in our active short-term rental licenses since March 19th. That's about 370 active licenses, and the number of unique properties that we were seeing declined 21% since March 19th. So they've both decreased at a substantial rate, more than we normally see during this time of year, but as we are all aware, it's likely due to the pandemic. So, any other questions about the licensing numbers? Okay, seeing none, we'll go on to some new data from our 311 calls, data and trends. So I wanted to start here with some information. I know that we have talked about in the past year, kind of improving the way we collect this data, the way we report the data, the way that the phone calls are classified by 311, so we can get a better idea of what people are asking. So this is the new kind of information that we're able to then present to you. And what it shows, as you can see, is the green bar there is 2020 year to date. So these are the calls we've received so far this year. And the blue line shows the types of calls that we got last year and the numbers. So last year, overwhelmingly, our 2 biggest buckets of calls dealt with applications and renewal questions, and then questions about administrative citations or notices of violation. Both of those are way down this year, much less than even half of what we saw last year. But our inquiries and questions and property complaints are still about the same amount. Property complaints are down a bit over the summer, especially as compared to last year. And again, I think that's just because we're seeing, you know, fewer bookings, fewer rentals, fewer people traveling, and those sort of things. So that kind of gives you both a visual, and the numbers are down there as well for each of those categories, just to kind of get an idea of all the 311 calls that we get about short-term rentals, what kinds of categories people are asking about. So in this next slide, you can see month by month, each of those, you know, 5 buckets there. We had a lot of questions and inquiries at the beginning of the year. And actually our numbers for applications and renewals have gone up as we move out throughout the year, but you can see we have very few questions about administrative citations or notice of violations, probably because we're not issuing as many and we're not getting as many property complaints, although those were up a little bit in July. So just hoping that this kind of data gives you all a better idea of some of the trends that we're seeing, things that people are curious about. As always, we can make sure that our policies and procedures are tailored to the data. And finally, this slide is similar to what we looked at last time. It just shows you comparatively, while our volume of calls is obviously smaller so far this year, the percentage of the types of questions that we get as compared to last year. So does anyone have any comments or questions about the 311 data? No? Okay. All right, great. So next we'll talk about some application data. I know in April when we sent the virtual update, we did a kind of week by week. Here's where our applications are at. That was kind of in the beginning of the pandemic, and letting people know what the numbers were for new applications as well as renewals. So in our pending applications, we have currently about 196. 40 of those are awaiting action by the applicant. 101 are under the review by Excise and License, either initial review or affidavit review. And then 55 of those 196 are under review by a different city agency. So it is awaiting city action, but through one of our partners. And then the bottom part in our new applications, either for a new license or for a renewal application, we can see that the numbers have they went down a little bit, but they're bouncing back from April through July. We had 143 in April, down to 113 in May, 153 in June, and then up to 163 in July. For reference, we had a total of 173 back in March, and we did outline that in the April update. So it looks like we saw the bottom of the dip there, and we'll continue to monitor that.
Erica, can you just please clarify that those numbers were for the month, not for a week total?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
It says week in May and June.
That is my fault and a result of me not reading this close enough. So thank you for that. Okay, Brian, if you're still there, if you want to go over these numbers, these haven't changed much, but just, you know, an update on the any applications that have either been withdrawn, closed administratively, or been denied, and then as well as the affidavits.
You know, I'm not sure I can update this. Is Alex on here?
Yeah, I'm here.
The applications and disciplinary action slide, is that all of 2020 or is that a continuing number?
It's a continuing number.
Okay.
So these are total since we started the enforcement program where we started tracking this.
Correct.
So for reference, the number of licenses that have been show caused has not changed since our update in April, I believe. And I believe we only have had a few applicants withdraw since then. So these numbers are very similar to the slides that came before them. In case anybody's wondering, we're not seeing a lot of action in this area. Our department is doing online hearings mostly, and so some of the hearings that would require in-person testimony or evidence have been modified or put on hold. So I don't anticipate we'll see a large increase in these numbers unless Brian has anything else to add.
Yes, we're starting to pick it back up now that we've gotten some experience with the online hearings and especially contested hearings. For example, today I sent up 4 or 5 denials, and I would assume probably 5 or 6 more tomorrow. So we are moving forward again with that, and that has caused some of the delay in the 2 months while we figured out how to do an online hearing, just like we're trying to figure out how to do online STRAC committees and have different people participate and things like that. So like I said, we've gotten some experience with the hearings. We've got some experience with contested hearings, and we're starting to pick up our rate of denials for short-term rental applications.
And processing those hearings where people appeal the denials, right?
Correct.
Okay. So hopefully by October we'll have a little bit better information and we'll see some of these numbers moving. But we'll keep you posted. So now we'll talk about the lodgers tax update. I'm not sure if Sophia's on, but we have currently 3,310 active lodgers tax accounts, while we have 2,205 short-term rental business licenses that are active. So as many of you recall, you need both of those to operate a short-term rental. And we have been tracking for a while now the difference, the number difference between that gap, right? There's about 1,100 lodgers tax accounts more than we have business licenses. So for short-term rentals. As far as lodgers tax collected, we have collected $3.1 million in 2020 year to date, making up 10.5% of the lodgers tax collected. So obviously hotels are making up a little bit less of a percent than they have in years past, while short-term rentals are staying about even compared to where we've been the last couple of years. However, July collections are up about 140% reviewed against May or June as far as short-term rental lodgers tax collections. So, Sophia, I don't know if you have anything to add or if anyone has any questions, but that's the lodgers tax update.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I don't see where the hand raising thing is, but I just put it in the chat. So these kind of correlate together. So if we looked at 2 slides ago, question's 2-part. I'm curious, like pending applications, if those numbers are pretty similar to where we were last year. I just know that the Denver Business Journal or someone had published an article saying short-term rental lodging tax is down 55% this year, this time period from January to June over last. And my concern there is 2.5 of those months were pre-COVID, so it was business as usual. And when I think about, where we might be at the end of 2020 with our deficits and necessary budgetary cuts, my concern is, are we doing, as much as possible to give people the ability to rent their homes, to subsidize lost income, and to bring revenue into our city that stays in our city? So it kind of applies to this slide and then the lodgers tax slide 2 ahead.
Sure. So in August of last year, we had, it looks about, if the numbers I'm looking at are, it looks like we had 154 pending applications. So we do have a little bit more than we had last year. And I think, like Brian said, some of that was due to figuring out how to do online hearings, figuring out how to do online doc review, online everything. And I'm trying to see, in August of 2019, we had collected $6.9 million as of August of 2019, where we're about half of that for this year. But as Sophia told me, the May-June period was much slower compared to July. So I don't know if she has any commentary about that, but looks like we're on the upswing.
Yeah, so this is Sophia. Lodger's tax is a little bit tricky to follow because what we have produced in these slides is the total that we've received as of August 1st. So July collections are not included in that valuation because July taxes aren't due until August 20th. So really that's mainly through the June collections, and April, May, June were definitely lower. July had the amount collected in July for June is increasing, so it's coming back up. On a total tourism industry, it's tracking the lodger's tax for short-term rentals versus the hotels is tracking still around that 10% level of total taxes collected. So we're kind of mimicking the same overall percentages of what the short-term rental industry is compared to the rest of the lodging industry year over year, but the revenues are definitely down, like the article said. There's been a lot of lost lodgers tax revenue in the city. Does that help?
Yes.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead, Dana.
No, I was saying yes. That confirms it. I guess my point is that I'm just trying to find out. Are we? I'm not saying open the floodgates and let everyone have a license. We have regulations, we have standards and stipulations and processes to follow. I'm just curious, with the economic crisis that we're in, both as a city and the citizens within the city, are we prioritizing the ability to grant those first-time license applicants the ability to start listing and to take advantage of some of this peak season? For Denver, this is our peak season. So yes, the graph will start to pick back up when we get our July revenue reported. But that's the trend that it would follow anyway this time of year in Denver. And then we have the impending fall and winter where things heavily decrease. So I'm just thinking of, as a host, if I was like, oh my God, I've lost my job, I want to take advantage of getting my license as soon as possible to make some money while it's peak season here in the city. I'm just asking on behalf of hosts, are we able to process those in a way that can help our own pockets as a city as well as the citizens that are applying?
So this is Molly from Excise and Licenses. I'll just chime in here. Yes, I would say the answer to that, your question is yes. So, that's one of our core missions, core mission as a department. We want to help stimulate and support economic recovery during this, economic crisis. And so we had a big role to play over the last several months, or the last 8 weeks really, on helping create a lot of the temporary patios that you're now seeing across the city. So that was a big effort that was it redeployed several of our staff members to focus on that. So there might be a little bit of, I wouldn't even say backlog, but there is a little bit of a delay in the licensing, but it is our goal and mission to get licenses issued that are in compliance with the law. So, if people are getting their applications in and we're able to review them and everything looks right, then we definitely want to get them issued as quickly as possible so that we can contribute and support to the economic health of our city.
Thank you.
Looks like Lisa has a question, and then Mary Lou. So Lisa, why don't you go ahead?
This tax update here on the lodger's tax collected, it includes hotels. Is that correct?
The total reported here is not inclusive of hotels. So that total on the slide is only from the short-term rental flagged accounts.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Sophia. Mary Lou?
Is there any way to identify from the lodger's tax accounts which STRs don't have business licenses?
Are you?
Go ahead.
Are you asking to use tax information to look to see which tax accounts do not have a corresponding short-term rental license?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we could. I think we'd have to overcome one hurdle of tax or the Treasury Department sharing that information. And Sophia, maybe you can talk to that a little bit. We generally don't just go to the Treasury Department and ask for information. They kind of keep a wall up for a variety of reasons. Which I
Well, and to add on to that, we in Treasury do a reconciliation to the lodgers licenses and excise and licenses. It's a little bit tricky in the tax world because people register their tax account under business names sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily tie to the primary property owner. So we do as much as we can to marry up the information. If someone potentially puts a lodger's tax number that's, miscoded on their application to excise and license, then it's a little bit harder for us to track back and forth. But our lodger's tax licenses are issued for 2 years. So there's a potential that we have an active lodger's license that files on an annual basis, but they have stopped short-term renting. And then until they get their return from us in January, they're like, oh, I need to stop my tax account. So sometimes there's a lag time in reporting of, that I won't know about their cancellation of their account until they get their next tax return. So there's always a bit of a difference in that regard, as well as, us trying to marry up the information, but we are trying to do that.
Okay, thank you.
As a property manager, I can tell you that I think clients that used to short-term rent and no longer rent, I have at least 5 lodger's tax accounts that don't have business licenses attached. They also don't have active listings. It's just, ghosts in the system effectively until paperwork comes through and the owners get around to clearing it out.
And we had used this information previously to spur, the difference that we were seeing. It spurred some participation in workshops and educational opportunities for those who wanted to, start a short-term rental business, letting them know, raising awareness that they needed both. And so that was one of the, effects of tracking this information, just knowing that, hey, as we saw some numbers increasing, we need to do a little bit more community outreach. So any other questions about the lodger's tax update? Great, moving right along. So next we have some current events. So had a nice roundup here. The first thing to know is that State Alfred, which is a short-term rental platform that operated a little differently. They had operated in at least 4 apartment complexes in Denver, at least briefly. They are leaving the city. They will no longer be operating here. They didn't leave a comment. Oops, they didn't leave a comment or anything, but I've linked the article if anyone would like to read more. A couple of things in other cities. Everyone's kind of seeing some similar things, but in LA, there was an article in the LA Times that was released estimating that about 42% of the city's active Airbnb listings were out of compliance. And they had an agreement between the city and Airbnb to remove listings. So I know we've got some Airbnb folks here today. I think they're planning to discuss that a little bit in their update, but you can read that article from this slide. In Chicago, the mayor has laid out some proposals to combat party houses, especially in the time of COVID. Their preferred method or their current proposal is to propose a ban on single night stays in the city short-term rentals. So hoping that that curbs the party house trend. However, that comes with some pros and cons, as you all might be aware. So you can read about that in the link. And then finally in New Orleans, kind of the story that we're seeing across the country, homeowners discussing how the pandemic has, devastated some of their income that they collect from renting their homes, but also the love of their guests that they host from all over the world. So wanted to make sure I highlighted that story there. As always, if you have any news or happenings that you want to share, feel free to send those to me and I'll include them in the presentation. Thanks to everyone who sent these stories. Does anyone have any questions about any of this? Nope. Great. All right. Then we will move to, I'll hand it over to Aisha and Matt for the Airbnb update.
Awesome. I'll let Matt kick us off and then I'll jump in.
Oh, Matt, are you with us?
Sorry about that. I had it on mute. Sorry, apologize.
No worries.
Aisha will go through and give an update on some on a number of relevant things, but given that you just mentioned the LA Times article, and I've been actively involved in LA for a number of years, let me just touch on that real quick. So Los Angeles passed a home sharing law about a year, almost 2 years ago, that allows people to rent their own homes with a permit. They started enforcing on the law last July 2019. The registration process started last July 2019, where people could sign up and get a permit to rent. And then enforcement began in November of 2019. They gave hosts a number of months to be able to register, and then they began enforcement in November. So the city has been enforcing as of last November. In November, we also reached an agreement that the city was very interested in trying to come up with as many listings there as to set up an automated enforcement system. And so at their urging, we agreed to develop a first in the world automated API system with the city that would we would provide data to them. They would tell us which listings were out of compliance, and then we would agree to, and then we would automatically take those listings down. As part of that agreement, there was 2 steps. One, we agreed and did in last November, took down thousands of what we called categorically ineligible listings. They gave us a list of properties that were for rent, that were in rent-controlled units, which are prohibited in short-term rentals in rent-controlled buildings in Los Angeles are prohibited. Short-term rentals in subsidized affordable housing are prohibited, and short-term rentals are prohibited in what are called Ellis Act buildings where somebody had been wrongfully evicted. They gave us a list of buildings that fit those categories, where Airbnb listings were, we matched those and took down thousands of listings in those buildings last November. Also, though, as part of that agreement, the city told us that we would not have to take down unregistered listings. We would not have an obligation to take down unregistered listings off of our site until such time that the automated registration system was launched. So we were just about to launch the automated system in the third week in June. We actually sent out a press release that said it was going to be launched. It had been delayed a bit due to some events due to COVID, but we were just about to launch it in June, at which time all of those unregistered listings unregistered listings on our platform would have been taken down. However, shortly before that happened, going back to the discussion we just had on the lodging tax, the mayor's office sent out a directive to all city departments saying, do not implement any policies that will have a negative implication on city revenue, given the fiscal emergency that everybody is facing due to COVID. And so that related to the planning department then notified us that we were not to take down unregistered listings because they continue to generate lodging tax until such time that the planning department submitted a report to the mayor's office about fiscal impacts. So, so those listings stayed up. The city still has 100% authority to go on and enforce on those listings on their own, which they continue to do very actively. But we are, in compliance with our agreement with the city. We have taken down thousands of unregistered listings already, and as soon as the city tells us to turn on our API system, the rest of the unregistered listings on our platform will come down. So just to give you some perspective, in Los Angeles, the transit occupancy tax there generates, in a normal year, about $60 million a year. And so the downturn there in lodging tax and the implication of taking down more revenue generating listings is obviously a big concern. And so that was sort of that's sort of the background to that article.
Well, we'll be watching this clearly, that's for sure.
It will be, like I said, it will be it will be a very good system for the city. It will probably be the most advanced registration and compliance system in the country. And so we've been working with host compliance there as well. And so that's where we are in LA.
And thanks for that.
Hey, Matt, this is Brian. I just had one quick question about that API. Was that developed by you guys, by host compliance, by the city?
We developed it.
Okay.
Matt, just one quick question. This is Susan. On the 60 million in lodgers tax, is that short-term rental only? So again, extracted from any hotel lodgers tax?
That is just Airbnb short-term rental.
Airbnb only. Okay.
Airbnb only.
And I'm sorry, Matt, one other question. So that's API based, so system to system, right? Data transfer. Before this more sophisticated API interface, in some of the others that you've communicated around the world where you've done data sharing, you know what I mean, in a different model, less sophisticated, is that batch or some other format that is less, doesn't include the data matching and the data transfer that you would have with hooks, system to system via APIs?
They vary in terms of how they do it. It's usually pretty, a lot of them are Google spreadsheets with the listing ID numbers that they identify as listings that we need to take down, that we match and then remove from our site. So most are much more simplistic.
So highly manual to highly automated, in that continuum.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And given the thousands of listings in Los Angeles, the city was very interested and urged us to, strongly consider this type of system because, the resources for them to manage applications and registration and enforcement on, 30,000 listings it's obviously a lot.
Yeah. Thanks.
So I'm going to turn it over to Aisha if there's no other questions to hit on some other highlights.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So just a few high-level updates on what we've been working on over the last few months as travel, as you all know, has gone, came to a standstill for a while, and I think now is starting to open back up as stay-at-home orders are lifted, in some cases coming back down. So first, we really, I think the virus showed us the absolute need for short-term accommodations for those on the front lines, including those working in the hospitals, city workers, folks delivering PPE. So to date, we've donated over $5 million to communities in times of need. We've booked over 150,000 nights and free stays for both first responders and domestic violence and human trafficking survivors in a combination of different pilots that we've run across the country. The second piece that we are working on, and this is with some folks on the STRAC itself, but we started working with DMOs. So as cities and states as travel is opening back up, how do we think about our relationship with cities and really be seen as thoughtful partners? And so we have started the conversation with Visit Denver. Huge shout out to MC, who's on the committee itself, but we are thinking through, a co-branded marketing campaign to bring travel back to Denver. So as you all saw, the booking data and lodgers tax data is continuing to go up. How do we really maximize on your peak season? So we'll continue sharing updates there. And third piece, I think this is an issue of interest to this committee specifically, but party houses, as parties are happening or, enforcement is required of Airbnb. We very recently announced a new initiative preventing U.S. guests under the age of 25 from booking entire home listings in the local areas where they're from, unless they have a history of positive reviews. And so U.S. guests under the age of 25 with less than 3 positive reviews won't be able to book entire home listings close to where they live. They can still book any other type of listing. And I'm happy to send along some articles detailing all 3 of these initiatives so you guys have some information to go off of. And then finally, we've been in touch with Excise and licensing. I know an updated ordinance is of the highest priority. And so again, we just want to continue working with you all on getting an ordinance that we all feel comfortable with on our end, getting a compliance system set up so we can head into the new year with a system that just helps all of us. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, this is David Pardo. One question that I had is when it comes to the prevention of the local bookings to prevent parties, which as a host I appreciate very, very much.
Yeah.
Are you guys basing that on the location of their IP or the location that they say is their name? And is there a specific, like, not within 25 miles or not within 50 miles? Like, what's the mechanics of that?
Yeah, really good question. I can definitely do some digging and right after this call, send out some details.
Awesome.
Aisha?
But it is, we can give you some details on the proximity, but it's single night bookings from a location within a proximity to the booking itself. That's sort of the general
algorithm.
Yeah.
Aisha, one thing I thought was really interesting that I don't know if you and Matt can share with the group, but I was invited to a call that was done with selected hosts around the country, and it was to provide an update not only on what you just shared, which was this party house and, kind of like rental car companies do, right? Guests under 25 and these parameters. But the other things I found exceptionally interesting were the 3 points that were discussed around Airbnb hitting 1 million nights of bookings again post-COVID. And then the discussions about the behaviors of travelers during COVID and what we're seeing as trends, because I think I found that fascinating, and I think the STRAC would too.
Sure. So I can kick us off, and then Matt, feel free to jump in.
Okay.
Sure. So travel, I think booking data is kind of on par with exactly where it was a year ago. High level things that we found are after 4 to 5 months of sheltering in place, they have an itch to get out again. But I think the number one prime concern of guests is safety. So how do we safely travel? And in that vein, I think the fact that Airbnbs are entire homes, there aren't many shared spaces or shared lobbies, has been really helpful. So folks are going to more remote locations. They're looking for contactless entry, so not really interacting with folks outside of their household. And then they're driving instead of flying. So high level, like travel trends, those are the things we picked up. I think it's been a long few months of sheltering in place, and folks are looking to get out, but they're looking to explore places that are safe.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, it's the trends are clear. I mean, people are traveling much closer. They're driving. They're not flying, clearly the data is also showing to us that people feel safer in a short-term rental. They're able to, socially distance easier. They have options to cook meals as opposed to having to go out to restaurants, for every meal, which, becomes challenging from a social distance standpoint. And so, we think these trends are pretty clear. Whether or not they reflect pent-up demand or whether they're a continuing trend, we'll see. But we do think these trends are clear, and we also think these trends are going to be, sustained for a period of time. In that people will, drive more, stick closer to home, explore places they've not seen. The travel will be dispersed. You'll see, less mass tourism for the foreseeable future, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
That's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and Matt, the only comment I would make from my notes from the call last week, which I thought would be interesting as well, and you and Aisha jump in if you have different data, but what was shared with us is that more than 50% of the nights stayed or travel in general post-COVID has been within 300 miles of where the person lives. Yep. And I think that is really an interesting statistic, and it's interesting for us in Denver, and maybe Molly, for you and the team, based on your comment earlier about the last 8 weeks and the initiative that you were describing, perhaps with all the efforts around Visit Denver and revitalizing Denver, just our ability as a broader team for those that do travel to Denver to be cultivating, places like Omaha and St. Louis and, all the nearby geographic locations where people may want to have a different experience and can come to Denver to do that, where we might not have the Chinese guests and the international guests that we've historically had. So anyway, Matt and Aisha, I just think maybe there's an opportunity in some of the data. I mean, Airbnb is outstanding at data analysis, among other things, but that's one area that I think would be interesting. I don't know, Erica, if it takes a shape and we think about it as a task team, but I sadly think that COVID is with us for some time to come, or at least the behaviors around what people are having to grapple with. And maybe there's a way for Denver to benefit thoughtfully around the local driving scenario and how many states are adjacent to us. So that's it. Thank you, guys.
And we're happy to. I mean, we're working with as Aisha mentioned, she's been working with the folks at Visit Denver. We've been working with different DMOs throughout the country and around the world to actually work collectively to help build campaigns to help drive traffic back to some of these jurisdictions, with the emphasis on the actual destination and not on Airbnb. We want to be partners with local jurisdictions in doing this. And part of that, we'd love to try and find a way that, and we're building out this capability to share with DMOs, is to share data about what we're seeing in Denver and surrounding areas, to be able to share with you a pretty deep dive in terms of those trends for whatever value that, would provide.
Yep.
This is Carrie with Visit Denver. I'll just quickly add that my colleagues on the marketing side and our partnership side have been having really good conversations with Airbnb around all of this. So more to come, which we'll update you all on. And we have put out a marketing campaign for the summer that is very much focused on the Drive regional market. So we are being very thoughtful in terms of where we are marketing, but really understanding that the trend is that people are driving right now and staying closer to home. And so our marketing efforts for Denver are focused on that regional, closer distance drive market.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carrie, Aisha, Matt, Susan. Anyone else have any other comments or questions before we move into our presentation from CPD? No? Okay, great. With that, I will hand it over to Mr. Abe Barge, who will discuss a topic I think we've been really wanting to, kind of dive into a little bit. I sent around the zoning interpretation, so we're going to kind of go over that and what it really means for ADUs and STRs. So Abe, take it away.
Thank you, Erica, and hello, everyone. I haven't seen many of you in quite a while, so I hope you're doing well. Want to dive into what can be a kind of a confounding subject of accessory dwelling units and their relationship to short-term rentals. And should I have you advance the slides, Erica?
Sure, yeah.
Go on to the next one. Okay, or maybe, no, I guess I'll have you do it. So the presentation is fairly short, but a little dense. And what I thought we'd do is be a little nerdy about it and go through the relevant zoning code definitions to this question to understand then how the zoning administrator got to that interpretation that Erica sent out in your packet regarding the use of accessory dwelling units for short-term rentals. So if you go on to the next slide. So we'll start with the definition of different categories of uses. So uses being activities on a property, typically, as opposed to physical structures, although the two things can kind of get confusingly intertwined sometimes. But basically the general categories of uses that we're usually talking about are primary uses and accessory uses. So primary uses are pretty much exactly what they sound like. It's the main activity that's happening on a property. And then accessory uses are something that are not always happening. In fact, it's really a minority of properties that really would have an accessory use in addition to a primary use. But that is another use that is related to the primary use. And I think it's important to remember that both in the definition of what an accessory use is that you see on your slide here, as well as the specific rules that pertain in zoning to all accessory uses, it's that they're clearly incidental, subordinate, and customary to or associated with the operation of a primary use. So there's a relation. There has to be a relationship between the two things. So having renting out some rooms in your house to be the world headquarters of an oil company that is not even your company is definitely not an accessory use. That would be another primary use and would have to be permitted as such if that was even allowed in the zone district where you reside. So if you move on to the next slide. So, and then just pause for the definition of dwelling unit, which relates to this conversation. So anything, any structure or portion of a structure that contains all three of the items shown on the slide constitutes a dwelling unit. So full or partial kitchen, a bathroom, a sleeping area. There can be some tricky things with this because, if you have a dwelling unit and it has, let's say, 2 bedrooms and it has a couple of bathrooms and, likely, well, it has a kitchen, and then you go to add another kitchen, that can essentially be the same thing as creating another dwelling unit, even though perhaps you wouldn't see it that way because it's not like a completely separate space or something like that. But as far as the zoning code goes, you're putting in another dwelling unit as soon as you've got 2 different sets of all 3 of those things. All right, so you can go on to the next slide. And then looking at what a primary dwelling unit is versus an accessory dwelling unit. So taking now that discussion of, what are primary uses, what are accessory units, what is a dwelling unit, and kind of bringing it together. A primary dwelling unit is, the definition varies in the zoning code depending on what kind of residential it is, like whether it's single unit, 2 unit, or multi-unit, but it's essentially the primary use version of a dwelling unit, meeting that, principal use of the property. And then an accessory dwelling unit use is a second dwelling unit that's located on the same zone lot as the primary single unit dwelling use. It's a type of accessory use, which means that it's subject to all of those things that are general to all accessory uses, that it's subordinate, for example. Also, I think it's important to note that the concept of accessory dwelling unit in the zoning code only goes with single unit dwelling uses. So basically a detached house is the only thing that can technically have an accessory dwelling unit. There might be situations where, there's a multi-unit building or row houses or something like that, and there's things that seem like accessory dwelling units. If that's the case and they're legal, they're permitted in some other way. They're not technically accessory dwelling units. They're probably just other primary dwelling units that have been permitted because it's a zone district that allows that. And then accessory dwelling units can be in the same structure as a primary dwelling unit, or they can be in a detached accessory dwelling unit structure. We tend to get pretty caught up on thinking of accessory dwelling units as being like carriage houses in the back. But I want to note that, like, for the purposes of all the regulations that we're talking about and the zoning code interpretation, an accessory dwelling unit is treated the same regardless of whether it's like a basement apartment that's been permitted or whether it's in a separate detached structure. The use is the same use. Buffy asked a question about treating a duplex as a primary residence on one side and an ADU on the other side. If you don't mind, Buffy, I'll hit that at the end. I think it's a good question, and I know people ask about that. I think we'll want to have a fair amount of discussion about that, so hopefully we can save that for a moment. I'm going to go to the next slide, Erica. So, okay, now getting into the definitions. So we just, of short-term, related to short-term rentals. So we just saw the definition related to accessory dwelling units. You're probably all more familiar with this one, the zoning code definition of the short-term rental accessory use. Provision of temporary guest lodging to non-residents for compensation by the person or persons maintaining the underlined, this is important, primary dwelling unit use as their primary residence, and then etc. And most of the rest of what it says is doesn't end up really coming into play for the discussion of accessory dwelling units. But then, noting that short-term rentals are subject to the same overarching principles as all accessory uses, that is that they're subordinate to the primary use and that they're associated with it. Okay, go on to the next slide, Erica. Okay, so I think we have all the information now from the zoning code that you would need if you were Tina Axelrad, our zoning administrator, to write that zoning interpretation. And the two most significant things, I think, are the broad language about accessory uses being subordinate to primary uses. And then the second piece is in short-term rentals, the language about the rentals being conducted by the resident of the primary dwelling unit. So, but just starting with the first one, we really only need the first one to answer the first couple of questions, the subordinate and incidental one. So, first question, can an applicant live in an accessory dwelling unit and conduct a short-term rental in the associated primary dwelling unit? Per the zoning administrator's interpretation, the answer is no. And I think you can use both of those pieces of information that I mentioned to get to that answer. But just looking at that first piece of information, the subordinate and incidental, I think the zoning administrator thinks is enough to get there. That if you were living in what's supposed to be the subordinate unit on the property and conducting the rentals in the primary unit or the big house, essentially, that's no longer an accessory use. It's not subordinate to the primary use if you're living in the cottage and conducting the short-term rental in the big house. However, question 2, can you live in the primary dwelling unit and conduct a short-term rental in an attached or detached accessory dwelling unit? The answer there is yes, because the accessory dwelling unit by definition is supposed to be subordinate to the primary dwelling unit use. And so is the short-term rental use supposed to be subordinate. I think both of those boxes are checked in this case because the person that lives in the big house, so to speak, is using the subordinate structure to conduct the subordinate use. On the next slide, there's just a couple more questions. So now I think we need to bring that second primary piece of information into it to answer at least one of these. And that's the language in the limitations on short-term rental accessory uses that say that it's the person or persons maintaining the primary dwelling unit use as their primary residence that's conducting the accessory use. So the third question, can an applicant live in an attached or detached accessory dwelling unit and conduct a short-term rental use in the attached or detached accessory dwelling unit? So here, the answer would be no. And I think in this case, that answer is based only on this second piece of information. Because the person who's living in the accessory dwelling unit is not the person or persons maintaining the primary dwelling unit use as their primary residence, they don't meet that limitation and so can't conduct the short-term rental. I would say that, that first piece of information about the use being subordinate, that box is checked, but the second one isn't. And so the answer is no. So question 4, can an applicant live in a primary dwelling unit use and conduct a short-term rental use in attached accessory structure that does not contain an accessory dwelling unit? This is just a kind of special case. Sometimes people have added, bedrooms and things like that are just not in the primary structure. And when that happens, that essentially is just an extension of the primary use. So it's basically the same thing as if that bedroom were just part of the primary dwelling unit use, because it essentially is. There isn't a separate dwelling unit. So the answer is yes. It's just a bedroom in the house, even if it's technically in the garage and isn't a separate dwelling unit. Okay, so this is kind of beating a dead horse at this point, I think. But looking at it just a slightly different way, if Tina, I don't know if this is Tina, the zoning administrator, or some other Tina, but if she lives in a house that's a primary dwelling unit and it's got a permitted accessory dwelling unit who she's renting out to Bob, who can conduct short-term rentals on the property. And I think it should be pretty clear at this point that it's only Tina. She both lives in the primary dwelling unit use, so she's the one that's conducting the short-term rental use. And so she's able to conduct a short-term rental use either in the primary dwelling unit, the one she lives in. Technically, she's allowed to do it in the accessory dwelling unit too. Practically speaking, she needs to talk to Bob about that, of course, who's living there as well. On the next slide, we'll just wrap it up, and then I'll come back to you, Aaron, and anyone else that may have their hand up, because I just want to note that everything about what I just said is just to gain an understanding of what the adopted zoning code says about short-term rentals and accessory dwelling units and how that's been interpreted by the zoning administrator. So that's the rules as they are. I'm sure you've had discussions in this committee about how things maybe should be different in some cases. And of course, that's possible. The zoning code would need to change for that to be the case. But that's something that can happen. And I want to note that there actually is adopted policy now that does suggest already some changes to the zoning code. And there's a couple of recommendations I want to highlight in particular that are part of Blueprint Denver, which is the citywide land use and transportation plan. A major update to that plan was adopted in 2040. And so there's a recommendation that's pretty expansive about accessory dwelling units in that plan. And it says diversify housing choice through the expansion of accessory dwelling units throughout all residential areas. So I don't think I noted before that, there's a lot of places where you're not even permitted to have an accessory dwelling unit by zoning, including most single unit districts in the city. But what Blueprint Denver says is that really the allowance should be extended citywide. And then it goes on to note a number of things that we need to have a conversation about and address before that happens. One of the things that's noted in that section is that accessory dwelling units that we should be exploring, well, really it says that we should be revising the zoning code to permit them associated with more than just single unit homes. So I mentioned before that right now there's only an association between single unit homes and accessory dwelling units, but we're directed to look at being more expansive about that. On the next slide, we're getting very close to the end here. There's just a little bit more information about one slide back. I think we might have skipped one. Actually, I think we skipped the one that was before this, or maybe I did. I think I just wanted to note what's highlighted on this slide, which is that the only place that Blueprint Denver mentions short-term rentals is in association with this recommendation about accessory dwelling units. And it says to study and implement incentives or requirements for income restricted accessory dwelling units, so they are more likely to provide affordable housing options, and then the highlighted portion, and tools to encourage the use of ADUs for long-term housing options rather than short-term rentals. So what does that mean? We could have a lot of debate about that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. But if you go 2 slides forward now to the very last slide, I want to note that that community planning and development is kicking off a project to implement those recommendations and answer those questions. We're calling the project for now residential infill until someone comes up with a catchier name. It's a catch-all project for the recommendation about housing options and design in lower scale residential neighborhoods across the city. It's going to be a big 2-year conversation. And it will explore implementing the recommendations that were on the previous slide about accessory dwelling units. So part of the project has to include figuring out what that little highlighted statement about short-term rentals and accessory dwelling units means. So we'll have that conversation. I'm sure you'll want to be involved in it. So we're actually kicking off the project, kind of a soft kickoff in September next month. So this is very timely. We can come back to provide regular updates to the short-term rental advisory committee. In the meantime, since there isn't a project webpage up yet and a real formal setup for outreach yet, you're welcome to contact me. I put my email address on this slide. If you have questions about it, if you really specifically want to be involved, because I think we'll have some opportunities for focus groups and other things to discuss both accessory dwelling units and their relationship to short-term rentals as part of the project. So thanks for listening. A lot of talking. Let me check. We just have Aaron with a question, and then I want to circle back around to Buffy's question as well. Aaron, is your
Abe, it's Amanda
Yeah.
Sawyer. I actually have a question too. I just can't figure out how to raise my hand. So
Okay. Well, since you're on, let's do your first and do you first.
no,
Then let's go to Buffy. Then let's go to Aaron.
Buffy's been waiting, so I'm happy to wait. Let's go to Buffy first. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So Buffy asked about duplexes. And so just to start, a duplex is typically two different primary dwelling units. And so from the perspective of the zoning code, a duplex is just two units that, would be a multi-unit if it were three and more. And so row house is a series of dwelling units from 3 on up to, any number that are facing the street, and then multi-unit would be other things that are multiple units that don't have individual units facing the street. There isn't, from a zoning code perspective, then there really is no special relationship between the two units that are in a duplex. They're just different dwelling units, just like one condo in a multi-unit building is different from another condo in a multi-unit building. However, because it's only 2 units, there's some interesting things you could contemplate. I know there's interest in, folks that own both units in a duplex in, living in one and certainly long-term renting the other unit, which is very much allowed. But then there's how about short-term renting the other unit? So we know that kind of the answer is, well, if they're 2 different dwelling units, you can't do that because you can't live in both of them at the same time, and there needs to be a primary resident. So what if, I think this is where Buffy is going, you just reclassify the duplex and you say it's actually a single dwelling unit, but that it's a single dwelling unit that has an accessory dwelling unit, and one of the 2 units is the accessory dwelling unit. Does that make sense? And from a, broadly, the answer is yes, that's possible. However, practically speaking, there are some barriers to that. So number one is, we went through the language about the accessory use being clearly subordinate and incidental to the primary use. Well, in a typical duplex situation, they're essentially equal. So it's kind of it's a little hard to make the determination then that one of them really can be subordinate to the other. That's a bit of a call that I think, would be hard to make, but you can see how there could be a challenge there. And then just getting into actual, more quantifiable challenges, there are rules about accessory dwelling units that might be hard for one of the 2 duplex units to meet. So one thing that the accessory dwelling unit limitations say is that it shall not be served by a driveway that's separate from that serving the primary single unit dwelling. And so, I mean, that's in areas where there isn't an alley, that might be an issue. Then there are some rules about entries that would suggest that the entry to the accessory dwelling unit really needs to be subordinate to the entry to the primary dwelling unit. In a typical duplex situation, they're equal. So that's a tough one. Then a real quantifiable one is just size limitations. There are limits on the size of accessory dwelling units that vary based on the size of the overall lot. So if you reclassify the duplex as a single unit dwelling, the lot we'd be talking about is the lot for the whole duplex. If it was 6,000 square feet or less, which I actually live in a half of a duplex, I don't own the other half. The lot is about 6,000 square feet. The limit is 650 square feet for the accessory dwelling unit. So like if I were going to buy the other unit in my duplex, and it's about 900 square feet, the same as mine. So it just wouldn't work. There would be no way for me to reclassify it as an accessory dwelling unit. If my lot was bigger, up to 7,000 square feet, it could be 864 square feet. I wouldn't be there in my case for the accessory dwelling unit. If I was on over a 7,000 square foot lot, we get up to 1,000 square feet. I mean, maybe at that point, there's a fair number of duplexes in the city that technically, you know, the units are 1,000 square feet or less. But, you know, I know this isn't a clear yes or no answer. I think it's more of a yes in theory, practically, probably not, I think is my answer. Does that work, Buffy?
Yes, yeah, I think that makes it complicated, but pretty clear.
Okay, great.
Abe,
Thanks.
Susan, once you get through the other questions, I would love to go after Amanda.
Okay, great. And remind me if I forget. So I think right now we're going Aaron, Councilman Sawyer, and then you'll be next after that. Aaron's mic might not be working, but feel free to jump in if it is. And her question in the chat is, was short-term rental policy used to drive the zoning conclusions, or did the zoning conclusions predate the policies? I specifically take issue with the inability to rent the primary unit while living in the accessory. Enabling that flexibility supports a continuum of housing options for individuals that don't want to leave their home but need additional income from either the accessory or primary. Seems like an unnecessary restriction. So I think what you're asking is basically when the short-term rental regulations were developed several years ago, you know, there was a pretty wide community conversation about this led by Councilwoman Sussman, Councilman Sawyer's predecessor. And was part of that conversation, did it clearly indicate that you shouldn't be able to live in an accessory dwelling unit and conduct a short-term rental in the primary dwelling unit? Or is it just that something about the way the zoning got written or language that predated this whole conversation in the zoning code just led to that zoning interpretation? And I think that I would say to some extent, where we are now is not necessarily something that was carefully considered in the conversation that led to adoption of the short-term rental regulations. Personally, my memory of those conversations actually would have produced a little different of an outcome. And from my memory, I think what would be most consistent with the conversation would be if the resident of either one of the units was the one conducting the short-term rentals, then they could do it. Meaning, if you lived in the accessory dwelling unit, you could conduct short-term rentals in that accessory dwelling unit, or if you lived in the primary, you could do it in the primary. It still doesn't, it still wouldn't allow for Aaron's example, where you're living in the small one and conducting short-term rentals in the large one. That's my memory of what would be most consistent with the conversation, but I think we just never, it didn't have a consistent resolution, and the way the zoning code reads now prohibits it. So again, just to be clear, it's not allowed by the zoning code now. Whether or not that was what should have happened based on the conversation, I think we could have some question about that, and that will feed into the conversation that we're going to have moving forward about any zoning changes. Aaron had a second question. If the city seeks to apply income restrictions on an accessory dwelling unit or incentivize long-term rentals over short-term, then some of financial subsidy must be made available to the owner. And so, yeah, so that question really relates to how we interpret that Blueprint Denver guidance moving forward. And so I'm not sure Aaron's really looking for an answer. I don't actually have one because that conversation hasn't begun yet. We just need to figure out what to do with that particular piece of policy. And I think, you know, there's different ways you could look at it, of course, from being very, very literal about it and saying that it means that you shouldn't be able to short-term rent accessory dwelling units at all, which would be a change over what's allowed now, versus something else like, you know, and I honestly don't know what that looks like. Perhaps it would only be incentives, that there's actually some subsidy in order to do long-term rentals at a lower rate to qualified applicants, but that you could still do short-term rentals. So I think all of those things are possibilities to discuss.
And just
so,
jump in here real quick. Just let everyone know it is 5:28. So I think this is a really good discussion, and it seems like there's a lot of questions, but definitely want to be respectful of people's time. As long as it's all right with Abe, we can continue recording the session and answering those questions. And if you have to hop off, feel free to send those along. There's not much else in the presentation that isn't self-explanatory. So if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Erica, because I think this is a great conversation, Abe, for all of us. And there's so many interesting questions, at least to tee up, even if we don't, you know, understand them all today. So this is a great forum for that. So thank you, Erica, for allowing us to stay on.
And I'm willing, yeah. So,
thanks,
keep
Abe.
them coming.
Yeah, no, thanks for being willing to stay a little longer. I think we all really appreciate it, because I really think that this is I'm glad that Aaron brought up these two questions, right? Because I think this is sort of like the meat and potatoes of the whole ADU conversation when it comes to kind of identifying the issues that are around ADUs and short-term rentals and how the two dovetail, and allowing people to use their property to, you know, have as much extra income as they can, while also recognizing that we want to continue to keep the character of the neighborhoods, you know, as best we can. But we also want to bring ADUs into the neighborhoods as you know, ADUs are sort of we were talking about this last night at City Council. We had a number of ADU rezonings that came in, and ADUs really are sort of for the neighborhoods in particular that are single family zoned, that where people really have purchased their homes in those neighborhoods because they are the grass, right? And the character is a little bit more mellow, a little more suburban, a little more, you know, what I would describe as old school Denver, right? those neighborhoods, what Blueprint Denver says is that we have to share the burden of density and bringing development to all of the neighborhoods. And so the way to add that gentle density while still respecting the character of those neighborhoods is through ADUs. And so if we're going to do that, this conversation becomes really important, because the discussion around, and so I'm getting to my question now, the discussion around particularly short-term rentals and the cost of short-term rentals and its effect on affordability and rent versus long-term rentals is a real concern. Do you have any information about what that looks like in other cities and how, whether it has had an effect in other cities as where there are significantly more ADUs than there are in Denver, because they're new here and they're just sort of becoming prolific here? Do you have any information about what that looks like in other cities?
So most of the information that I'm familiar with is several years old now, because, you know, it came from when we were having the conversation about permitting short-term rentals in the first place. It's possible that the licensing folks have some new information, or even probably the folks from Airbnb are gone. But I know that it's been challenging in the past, I think, to specifically determine that use of property for short-term rentals has had an upward effect on overall property values. But critics...
I'm not asking about property value. Sorry to interrupt. I'm not asking about property value. I'm asking about rent. I'm asking about the price of rent and affordability of long-term rentals versus you know, an entry into ability into neighborhoods versus short-term rentals and that ability in neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah, sorry, poor choice of words. Yeah, I should have said impact on affordability in general of housing. Is there isn't like a perfect answer to that yet. I think some studies have pretty clearly indicated that there's no impact, but then critics have said that there were problems with those studies, or that, you know, they were looking at whole cities when the impacts could be extreme in certain neighborhoods where there are a lot of short-term rentals, for example. And unless there have been really good new studies done in the last few years, I don't think the question is fully answered yet. And you're probably right that it depends on the number of short-term rentals that are occurring in the community. You know, when we're talking about having, sorry, I was sending emails when Erica was giving the presentation, or I'd know this number, like 5,000 or whatever short-term rentals that we have in Denver, compared to the number of dwelling units we have overall, you know, it's less than 1%. And therefore, you know, people would say, like, well, how much impact could it really have when it's that low of a percentage of the total housing stock that's in short-term rentals? But again, I think, you know, there are a lot of factors to consider, and neighborhood is a really big one, like the individual neighborhoods that short-term rentals are clustered in.
Okay, well, I think as we are, I don't think we can have this conversation without that information. I don't think that we can reasonably be expected to be able to make data-based decisions without data. So I just, as we start to move forward in this conversation and as we start to move forward in this discussion, I think I'm just going to urge that we make sure that we come up with that data. And if we're not tracking it now, let's start tracking it now so that we have it to move forward with. Because I don't believe that we can have this conversation without that data. And what I'm hearing is we don't have that data. So I'm just going to put that out there and ask a request that we start tracking that now so that we can have this conversation in a way that is based in fact and not in emotion when we put it on the table. Thanks.
No problem. And yes, we will do our best. There may be some challenges. Many other cities have gone forward and basically made short-term rental regulations that were pretty restrictive on the fear that it could have an upward impact on rents without the data being complete, I think, because it's been so difficult to come up with reliable data on it. Maybe I'll answer, there was one really easy question from Cindy. Does a detached dwelling unit have to contain a separate bathroom? Yes, otherwise it wouldn't be its own dwelling unit. Susan, I think we said you came after Councilwoman Sawyer. Do you still have a question?
I do, and maybe part of this, Councilwoman Sawyer, would be useful for you on the City Council initiative, and Abe, for you on your September kickoff that you highlighted in the slides. City of Seattle did a fairly exhaustive analysis over 2 years, and they adjusted their zoning code fairly materially in July of last year. And they made major changes in residential neighborhoods in urban Seattle that I think would be useful for the city of Denver to look at. It's quite interesting. So I'll give you one example. The lot sizes are quite different in Seattle. We tend to have 6,250. In Denver is kind of a full size, people call it a double lot, but is a large lot. And then minimums of 5,000 or 5,500 square feet before an ADU would be allowable, even if Blueprint Denver or the zoning code allows for it. But in Seattle, they did something very interesting, which I don't think we've even begun to think about in Denver. And I don't know what I even think about it other than they did an awful lot of analysis, Amanda, to come up with the data, both on long-term and short-term rentals. But what they determined is in single-family zones where people felt very protected by the green grass or, the separate garage, they created an allowance where people can have an ADU and a basement apartment simultaneously, and up to 12 unrelated people living. I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm just throwing it out there. So in theory, you could have 4 people living in the main house, 4 people living in the basement. You'd have to have a fairly large ADU to have 4 people there. But previously, they had all kinds of zoning code limitations around relationships related living in a given on a given piece of property with various structures. So they did this because affordable housing is a major issue in Seattle, like it is in Denver. And I've heard a lot of the backlash from residents and just different elements of feedback. And a year later, from the articles I've seen in the Seattle Times, people are beginning to digest this and think about the positive elements of density and what they can bring. So they're not that far along, Abe, ahead of us, but I think that would be a really interesting city to look at, because Seattle proper in terms of population is actually very similar to Denver if we take Denver Metro. So, they have a little bit different, kind of revenue per capita. They have some other statistics that are different than ours, but I think that would be interesting. So that's just sort of a follow on to Amanda. And I wanted to share with Abe that I think they're an interesting city to look at. The other 2 questions, Abe, I had for you are in your duplex discussion. I think the paradigm established is what a duplex might look like. And I don't know what we call that architecturally, but if it's like a Denver 4 square, or it's a small flat building, single story where you have doors on both sides, and view that as a duplex. And we're one city in the country that sells those separately. Many cities sell a duplex as an integrated building, and they don't subdivide them. But we have all kinds of different, I moved to Denver from California, so I kind of am comparing it to California. But what I would say is that there are many duplexes that were single family homes rezoned as what are called duplexes. And what that really means is you have a house upstairs and a downstairs staircase, which I would say architecturally is certainly subordinate. It may not be subordinate from a zoning perspective, but where someone goes down a set of stairs to enter another door to the unit below, which is like a basement apartment. It just happens to have an exterior staircase versus an interior staircase. So I think one thing for us to all think about when we really are clear about what initiatives we're trying to achieve, what the objectives are, is to maybe think about all these different beyond a unit of 1, beyond a house with a primary use and an accessory use if you have an accessory dwelling unit, but also these other formats and other models that got swept in to the last zoning set of iterations, which I think were 14 years ago or so. Maybe there would be value in looking at those different types, because in many ways, that kind of a structure, which we heard someone, Erica, at the meeting that we had in the Bannock building, we had a gentleman ask a question. It's not part of STRAC. And, he had a structure like that. And he said, I really don't understand how it's different than if I rented my basement apartment or, it is called a duplex. And therefore now the STR model treats it differently than it would under primary use of a home and accessory use of an accessory dwelling unit. So I think I just share that, Abe, to tee it up, that somebody might want to capture that and look at that in the various types of duplexes. And I don't know a lot about triplexes and fourplexes and those uniquenesses, but it may be worth kind of considering that. So that's, I don't know if you have any reaction to that or any feedback, but when Buffy asked her duplex question, I sort of had a different angle at thinking about duplexes that maybe is slightly different than the way you responded.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, I was talking about duplexes in a kind of simplified way, that it's kind of the classic Denver duplex that you see, probably because I live in one, with the two separate entrances, like a little row house. But there are other kinds. And, if you live in a 2-unit district or a multi-unit district, where 2-unit uses are permitted, and you meet the minimum lot size and you have a big house, you could make it into 2 units, and then it would be a duplex, right? Even though it would look very different than where I live. And it is an interesting question, because when you do that, maybe the units are very different from each other. And one of them is relatively subordinate to the other. And in any case, there's really only one entrance. So that sort of subordination of the other unit is already kind of taken care of by that. So, this is something, we could, I think, I'd like to talk to Tina, the zoning administrator, about, but I think in that particular case, that might be an easier path to, if what you were trying to do was use one of the units as a short-term rental, to reclassify the whole thing as a single unit dwelling again, essentially, and then take one of the units and say it was an accessory dwelling unit and conduct the short-term rentals in there, and then it would be more likely that that unit could meet the standards. It's still going to have those size limits on it that are like specific square footage limits.
Right. And so I think it's just worthy of consideration, is why I wanted, to maybe put it on your radar for this initiative. And then the last question I have, which may be pertinent to all of us, and I did not realize this, I actually reached out to Brian to see if he might know the answer around these zoning issues. But I'm helping someone with a renovation, because I kind of like design and architecture, no formal training, but I love it. And what we learned in the process is they renovated the house, they pulled permits, renovated the house, kitchens, bathrooms, etc. And then they've decided now to convert a garage into an ADU. And they went to apply for their second address, which goes through zoning. And they got a note back from zoning that said, oh yes, typically we would just generate a second address because you're in a zone in the neighborhood of Berkeley. It's actually Regis, but called Berkeley on the zoning map. And they're on a 6250 lot on a corner. But in that neighborhood, on that street, lots are individually zoned to either allow an ADU or not to. So now they're having to go through a process of rezoning their lot. And having their lot rezoned to have a C1 instead of a C or a CU. And the process doesn't seem too onerous, Abe, or difficult, but it's pretty interesting because when they bought the house, they felt, or they thought they had data that would suggest they could build an ADU. And now the first step is a zoning amendment. And once if they are successful in that, then they'll go through all the other things, right? They've done a survey, et cetera. But I think all the time, I guess the reason I raise this is I'm learning things every single day that I didn't know. And so I wonder about that. Is that common across Denver? Do we have lots zoned individually where your next door neighbor could be zoned to allow for an ADU on the same size lot? but your lot may not allow for it without a zoning adjustment.
Yeah, so the situation that you describe, I think, is the result of this kind of interim condition where the citywide policies are more supportive of accessory dwelling units than they were before. And there's that blueprint policy that we saw on the slide that says that the allowance ought to be extended citywide, but that we ought to do that as a comprehensive project addressing various concerns, including looking at the relationship with short-term rentals for one thing. But then Blueprint Denver also says, in the meantime, it is appropriate to consider individual rezonings case by case to switch to zone districts that allow ADUs. And so some people have done that. And so it sounds like some people on that same block have already gone through that process. And that's what's created this patchwork. And then now we're circling back around to, okay, let's rationalize the rules across, all similar neighborhoods, basically. But it's just because there was kind of an interim path to get an ADU. And so, yes, if your friend wants to do the ADU within the next 2 years, that's basically the path if they're currently in a district that doesn't allow it.
Got it. Thank you, Abe, very much.
Okay.
So I think we have still quite a few questions, but I don't want to keep people too far past the originally allotted time. So here's an idea. Let me know what you think. If anyone else has any particular questions for Abe, I know David has been, still has a question, and Lisa was interested in a question. If you all want to send those to me, I can kind of compile a list of any questions from STRAC members that either did or didn't get answered, work with Abe to get some answers out, and then send them to all the committee members, and we can post those as part of the materials for the meeting on the website. Does that sound like a good plan to everyone?
I would say, Erica, if people want to stay and Abe doesn't mind, if he's got to field a couple more questions, if it's negatively impactful to others, no worries. But I think this is one of the most important topics we have ever talked about in the last several STRACs. I think there's a lot of lack of clarity around it, and I think the better informed we are, and that is really a good thing. So if the only way to do it is to distribute a FAQ, great, but I would vote for letting Abe continue if he does to go 10 more minutes or 5 more minutes.
Well, how about we continue up until 6 and at the very least get through David's question because he's been waiting for a long time, assuming he's even still here. And then, oh, great. And then we can follow up with Erica and Excise and Licenses on when's the right time to continue this conversation at another committee meeting.
Sure. And there are a couple of other slides that I do want to go over with the group. So just.
Oh, okay. Maybe you should, does it work to do that before we come back to David's questions, just so that you can get through that?
Why don't we answer David's question and then I'll do the slides and we can continue the conversation with additional questions.
Cool. All right.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm David, and my question is somewhat similar to Lisa's, but so I'm going to just give you a very quick rundown. I live on a 2,200 square foot lot, which I don't believe is legal per Denver zoning code, but the house was built 100 years ago and people did what they wanted to do back then. And this house was originally a single family home, and at some point, no idea whether or not they pulled permits. It was decades ago. It was divided into 2 units. From the exterior, there is literally no way to tell, because the entrance to both units is from the interior of the house. The issue is that it's operated in the past as a short-term rental where one person lived in one unit and one person rented the other. It's just the rules about, if you're this many square feet, like you could never have this house. You could never build this house in 2020. So I guess my question is, how does something like this work? How do we define, what a house like this is? And I'm not asking for an explicit answer for this property. I'm sort of like, where do I look in the zoning code? Because read a few hundred pages of zoning code, and I'm not finding a good answer.
Yeah, I think I might be oversimplifying it, but it's going to be classified as a compliant use as long as it was either legally permitted under some rules that were different before, or is so long ago that nobody can figure out how it came into being, but has been operated for a long time in this way, that it's basically that it is a 2-unit use, even though you couldn't create a new one on a lot that small, that's what it is, and that the rules about 2-unit uses pertain to it. So technically you couldn't live in one of the units and short-term rent the other one, unless it was actually workable to go through this thing that we've discussed, where you reclassify it as actually being a single dwelling unit that has an accessory dwelling unit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess a better clarification would be, to me, a duplex in my mind is a structure that has 2 separately deedable dwelling units, and a single unit is one where it's a single deed and you could not purchase one part of the property. Am I wrong in that? Because this is how you definitely couldn't sell off one half of the house.
So the zoning code, for the most part, doesn't get into ownership. There are some exceptions, and it's actually in accessory dwelling units that those come in. So a duplex does not have to be separately deedable. It's just 2 primary dwelling units. It can be separately deedable. So I don't think that the fact that there's no way to technically get it separately sold means that it's not a duplex for zoning purposes.
Cool.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Abe. It sounds like we might ask you to come back at our next meeting because there are still some more outstanding questions. I'll send an email so that even the folks who aren't on the call still can, get all the information. Well, I'll kind of compile the questions and answers from tonight, and then if you want to submit additional, Abe and I can work on getting those answered for you and continuing the discussion. So thanks, Abe, and thanks everybody for really bringing your A game to today's discussion. I do want to cover just a few slides before we hang up, because the other, I'm going to skip forward a little bit to some of the other topics that you had mentioned, STRAC committee being important for the next couple of meetings. So here's kind of that goal planning, aligning some of the goals and values that we had talked about with our next couple of meetings. So today we talked about, we had expanded data, we had our CPD presentation, and then I'll talk about the last thing just briefly, an update on the platform accountability legislation. That's something that we're going to go over in detail at our October meeting. And then in October, we can kind of talk about if we want to add a November meeting if we need it. And then December, we can look at other lodging license types. As we had a lot of questions about ADUs and zoning, I know that some committee members have asked about the lodging license and the difference between it and short-term rentals, and doing some education on that. So it sounds like this group wants to also in October discuss, continue the discussion with about ADUs and wrap that up. So on the platform accountability legislation, just wanted to give some high level. We are returning to that phase 2. You all said that was important. So we've re-engaged our city attorney's office to look at an ordinance that would add some new requirements for all platforms that process short-term rental transactions in the city, would impose liability on those platforms that process illegal short-term rental transactions, and then allow the city to fine such platforms, giving us a penalty mechanism for those who do process those illegal transactions. So on a timeline, what we're thinking is that we would, we have secured a date to present to the Mayor's Policy Review Committee. That's always the first step of any ordinance. So we are scheduled to meet with them on September 25th. As long as they give us the go-ahead, we would then be able to present draft language at our next meeting on October 13th. If necessary, we could review that draft language in November, but then we would present at the business committee, just like we did with the primary residence ordinance, and it would then go to the full council if passed out of the committee. So the last four of those are all open meetings with time allotted for public comment, just so everyone knows that, you know, there will be opportunities for feedback, and we can look at the public comments section to make sure that we're capturing thoughts about that. So with that, I don't know if anyone has any specific questions, but really the meat of that discussion will be had at the next meeting. So if there are no further questions, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Erica. I just have one quick question. I've spoken with a couple hosts that are part of the hosting community I'm a member of, and they've expressed questions to find out why this can't be a meeting with all the technology that we have that they're actually invited to. I think that there is a reason we don't have much public comment. I mean, zero public comment for this meeting from the last meeting because of that disconnect. Has there been any discussion just how those other meetings are going to be open to the public for public comment, bringing this style of meeting open for public comment and attendance?
So the reason we did it this way, it is a technology thing, and forgive me, it's not my forte, but the city technology services supports Microsoft Teams, and in order to allow for you know, committee members the ability to speak during the meeting, and then members of the public, it would require assigning each of you kind of a temporary account, and it's a lot of technological work. That said, if that's something that, you know, the committee members are interested in and interested in pursuing, I'm happy to put together resources and look into that to make that a possibility for future meetings. I can work with our TS team to see what the options are.
I can tell people to just chime in and send that they personally would like to, so you can kind of start to gather some feedback from the public. But I know it's been asked a few times to me about how come we can't have other people or the public attend.
Mm-hmm. Erica, I'm going to just jump in here as well. So council has been advocating with tech services that they come up with a different way to do things when it comes to public facing meetings, because while Teams is great for internal meetings with internal city agencies, it's not great for things like public comment. It's better to use like a Zoom webinar or whatever, because then there is a way to interface with to allow for public comment, which is what council does. So I would just put it out there that tech services is considering other options because of this very issue. So it may be worthwhile to talk to them about that.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I would suggest that we add is, I think when we have meaty content on an agenda like Abe's presentation, which I think was excellent, I would strongly suggest if our meetings are only going to be every 2 months and not every month, that we extend them by 30 minutes. So there's adequate time for people to ask questions from STRAC as a core. And then to Councilwoman Sawyer's point, if we can use a tool, like I was just on a very big Airbnb meeting with over 200 people on it. And what they did in Zoom, as you would have said, Councilwoman Sawyer, is they just muted all the people that wanted to be on public comment. They listened to the entire meeting, and then they had an opportunity to sequentially ask their questions. So what I worry about is I feel like the city, it's a responsibility of all of us to allow for public comment. And we're now in a situation where the data is just dead and old, because by the time people ask a question and they get an answer, it gets posted to a website, and 2 months later, we're on a different agenda, and the relevance has declined materially. So I think we're doing our public a disservice to not figure out how to do this.
Well, thank you, Councilwoman Sawyer, for the update from Technology Services. It's definitely something I will look into, and thank you, Dana, for raising it, and Susan as well. With that, it's 6 o'clock. We've gone 30 minutes over, so I don't want to keep anyone any longer, but I will get with Abe and we will work to make sure that we plan an additional session and make sure we get people the information they would like to continue the discussion about accessory dwelling units.
I had one really quick question for you, Erica, actually related to the ordinance. Will the ordinance language be emailed to all members of STRAC like before you guys meet with the mayor, or is there sort of a timeline for that?
No, it would be shared at the October STRAC meeting, so it will go out with the October meeting material packet.
Cool.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Again, apologies for the longer meeting, but I think it was a really good discussion, and hopefully those who had to jump off can catch the end of the recording. It will go out in our short-term rental bulletin. So have a great evening, everyone. Nice seeing you.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.